Dr Paul Monaghan.
Thank you, Mr Chairman. I'd like to begin by congratulating the Honourable Member for Hertsmere for leading this debate so effectively, and to other members indeed for contributing also in a very positive and intelligent manner. E-petition 120700 has attracted over 100,000 signatures, many from Scotland, which I think reflects widespread concern across the nations of the UK in regard to animal welfare generally and the welfare of dogs in particular. We've heard today alarming and upsetting reports of dogs being mistreated and abused in the dog meat trade. However, we must be cautious in our approach towards other countries' cultural practices and be sensitive in working to bring about change, as noted indeed by my honourable friend from Rutherglen and Hamilton West. This is particularly the case given the problems that exist within the UK in terms of the prevalence of animal crimes such as dog fighting. It's clearly important that we recognise our own weaknesses and respect the sovereignty of other nations. And again, I'm grateful to my honourable friend from Western Bartonshire for making that point so clearly, along with the honourable member for Belfast East. It is the case that many Asian countries have only relatively recently begun to consider dogs as pets, and so the animals are viewed very differently to the way they are viewed in the West. The reverse is also true, Mr Chairman. Some Asian countries consider cattle and pigs in very sacred terms and view our slaughter and consumption of those species as completely unacceptable. I hope this highlights the extent to which we must be mindful of other nations' rights and cultural practices. And again, I think that was a point very well made by the Honourable Member for Bristol East earlier. The SNP government in Scotland takes the welfare of animals very seriously and has led the way in protecting and promoting animal rights. I would wish that approach to be sustained. In that context, my colleagues and I in the Scottish National Party strongly condemn the abuse and inhumane treatment of all animals, including dogs, within the dog meat trade. We encourage a cautious and culturally sensitive approach to bringing about change that supports animal rights groups in South Korea and indeed in other countries. Some progress is being made in this regard, with a growing political movement in South Korea championing animal rights. We should encourage that movement. And I think we are all agreed on that point. E-petition 120702, relating specifically to South Korea and the dog meat trade, seeks to urge the South Korean government to end the unsympathetic and often brutal treatment of dogs. We know that in South Korea, an estimated 5 million dogs are slaughtered every year for their meat, and we understand that during the 1988 Seoul Olympics, the South Korean government attempted to hide dog meat restaurants from the international media to avoid criticism. That act implies, of course, both an awareness of the dog meat industry in South Korea and, perhaps more importantly, an understanding on the part of South Korea of how that trade is perceived by the outside world. 30 years later, many of us here today are concerned about the International Olympics Committee and the fact that it has authorised South Korea to hold the 2018 Winter Olympics, given that the abuse of dogs remains the same, if perhaps not worse. And that, indeed, was suggested by the Honourable Member for Strangford. On behalf of the Scottish National Party, I would ask the UK Government to speak against the IOC's judgment and ask the South Korean Government to respond to the dog meat issues identified here today with a view to making the abuse of dogs in this trade illegal. I alluded earlier to the fact that South Korea is not alone in allowing the breeding and slaughter of dogs for human consumption. The World Dog Alliance, as we've heard, has produced an important analysis of this lucrative trade across Asia. Sadly, the trade is common across Asia, with countries such as China, the Philippines and Vietnam, in addition to South Korea, considering it culturally acceptable to varying degrees to eat dog meat. Many will be surprised to learn that dog meat, however, is also consumed in Switzerland, Mexico, the Arctic and the Antarctic, despite most Western cultures considering the slaughter of dogs for meat unacceptable. What is perhaps important here is the condition in which dogs are often kept prior to being slaughtered for human consumption. Some argue that dogs are often tortured before being killed because of a belief that it causes their meat to be tender. There are also concerns that most so-called meat dogs are stolen companion dogs and strays which are kept in terrible conditions, being transported from country to country. These are distressing accounts that reflect practices inconsistent with the Korea Food and Drug Administration's regulations that classify dog meat as a repugnant food. I am pleased also that South Korea's Animal Protection Amendment Act of 2007 expressly prohibits some of the cruel methods used by people in the dog meat trade to handle and slaughter dogs. However, animal rights groups have found that these regulations have had little impact to date on the trade in dog meat. Perhaps more promisingly, animal rights groups have pointed out that the consumption of dog meat is going out of favour with younger generations. And again, this should be encouraged. Given that there are no international laws prohibiting the consumption of dog meat, the challenge for the UK Government is not therefore one of intervening or implementing trade measures against countries where the consumption of dog meat is regarded as culturally acceptable. The challenge is one of diplomacy, and for the UK Government to instruct ambassadors and Foreign Office officials to raise the issues highlighted here today with the governments of China, the Philippines, Vietnam, Switzerland, Mexico, South Korea and, of course, others. Indeed.
Giving way. Does the Honourable Gentleman agree with me that for those approaches to be successful, they've got to be handled extremely sensitively to avoid them being counterproductive? And if they are handled sensitively, that gives us the best chance of achieving the progress we want to see.
I absolutely agree with the Honourable Member. Clearly, if we're going to have an impact and an influence on other nations that are trading in dog meat and are allowing the consumption of dog meat, we have to do that very, very sensitively in ways that are culturally sensitive and also reflective of our own practices here in the UK. Indeed, yes.
Thank the Honourable Member for giving way. Would he agree with me that, despite the apparent desperation of the UK Government regarding potential trade ramifications of Brexit, that should be no rationale for failing to put pressure on countries who engage in animal welfare cruelty issues such as South Korea in terms of the dog meat trade?
I absolutely agree with my honourable friend. I think there is nothing to allow Brexit and our attempt to influence the practices of other nations to occur in parallel. In doing all of that, Mr Chairman, the UK Government must reflect the interests and concerns of all those that have signed this petition and must advance those interests in a sensitive and supportive manner, as I've said, to bring about an end to the abuse of dogs farmed or stolen for human consumption. The UK Government should also provide diplomatic support for animal rights groups that are operational in South Korea and support their valuable work in taking action in a culturally sensitive and educational manner. In response to this petition, the UK Government has already stated, quote, "The British Embassy in Seoul has raised the issue of cruelty towards animals on numerous occasions with the South Korean authorities and explained that the UK public and parliamentarians would like to see Korean regulation that would bring the practice to an end. We will continue to seek further opportunities to raise the issue, in particular as we approach the Winter Olympics in 2018, and will monitor developments in the practice in the Republic of Korea. In the absence of international norms, laws or agreements governing the trade and consumption of meat, the Scottish National Party believes that it is necessary to work with governments around the world to build consensus on animal welfare standards and to phase out cruel and inhumane farming. The trend in South Korea is such that dog meat consumption seems likely to diminish and perhaps even end due to growing public awareness and recognition of both animal rights and the health risks associated with eating dog meat. Dogs, Mr Chairman, are known to be intelligent, trusting, empathetic and possess a range of senses of such acuity that we've only just begun to identify and fully understand. Dogs are one of the few animals capable of following a human's gaze, and this implies awareness of other. These attributes arguably differentiate dogs from other animals, and certainly other animals that are normally farmed. We ask the Government to take affirmative action to listen and hasten an end to the consumption of dog meat in South Korea. The Scottish National Party will support that diplomatic mission.